Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. The Crisis in Our Party, published May 1904. E. The Equality of Languages Incident. Let us return to the chronological order of the Congress sittings. We have now convincingly seen that even before the Congress proceeded to discuss its actual business, there was clearly revealed not only a perfectly definite group of anti-Escroists, 8 votes, but also a group of intermediate and unstable elements prepared to support the 8 anti-Escroists and increase their votes to roughly 16 or 18. The question of the position of the Bund in the party, which was discussed at the Congress in excessive detail, reduced itself to deciding about the principle, while its practical decision was postponed until the discussion on organization. Since the points involved had been given quite a lot of space in the press prior to the Congress, the discussion at the Congress produced relatively little that was new. It must, however, be mentioned that the supporters of Raybochidialo, Martynov, Akimov, and Bruguière, while agreeing with Martov's resolution, made the reservation that they found it inadequate and disagreed with the conclusions drawn from it. Pages 69, 73, 83 and 86. After discussing the position of the Bund, the Congress passed on to the program. This discussion centered mainly around amendments of detail which present but slight interest. The opposition of the anti-Escroists on matters of principle found expression only in Comrade Martynov's onslaught on the famous presentation of the question of spontaneity and consciousness. Martynov was, of course, backed by the Bundists and Raybochidialoists to a man. The unsoundness of his objections was pointed out, among others, by Martov and Plekhanov. It should be noted as a curiosity that the Escrow editorial board, on second thoughts, apparently, have now gone over to Martynov's side and are saying the opposite of what they said at the Congress. Presumably, this is in accordance with the celebrated principle of continuity. It only remains for us to wait until the editorial board have thoroughly cleared up the question and explained to us just how far they agree with Martynov, on what points exactly, and since when. Meanwhile, we only ask, has anyone ever seen a party organ whose editorial board said after a Congress the very opposite of what they had said at the Congress? Passing over the arguments about the adoption of Escrow as the central organ, we dealt with that above, and the beginning of the debate on the rules, which it will be more convenient to examine in connection with the whole discussion of the rules, let us consider the shades of principle revealed during the discussion of the program. First of all, let us note one detail of a highly characteristic nature, namely, the debate on proportional representation. Comrade Igorov of Yasny Raybochi advocated the inclusion of this point in the program, and did so in a way that called forth the justified remark from Posadovsky, an Escroist of the minority, that there was a serious difference of opinion. There can be no doubt, said Comrade Posadovsky, that we do not agree on the following fundamental question: should we subordinate our future policy to certain fundamental democratic principles and attribute absolute value to them, or should all democratic principles be exclusively subordinated to the interests of our party? I am decidedly in favor of the latter. Plekhanov fully associated himself with Posadovsky, objecting in even more definite and emphatic terms to the absolute value of democratic principles and to regarding them abstractly. Hypothetically, he said, a case is conceivable where we Social Democrats would oppose universal suffrage. There was a time when the bourgeoisie of the Italian republics deprived members of the nobility of political rights. The revolutionary proletariat may restrict the political rights of the upper classes in the same way as the upper classes used to restrict its political rights. Plekhanov's speech was greeted with applause and hissing, and when Plekhanov protested against somebody's Zwishenov, you should not hiss, and told the comrades not to restrain their demonstrations, Comrade Igorov got up and said, since such speeches call forth applause, I am obliged to hiss. Together with Comrade Goldblatt, a Bund delegate, Comrade Igorov challenged the views of Posadovsky and Plekhanov. Unfortunately, the debate was closed, and this question that had cropped up in it immediately vanished from the scene. But it is useless for Comrade Martov to attempt now to belittle or even altogether deny its significance by saying at the League Congress, these words, Plekhanov's aroused the indignation of some of the delegates. This could easily have been avoided if Comrade Plekhanov had added that it was of course impossible to imagine so tragic a situation as that the proletariat, in order to consolidate its victory, should have to trample on such political rights as freedom of the press. Plekhanov, Mayor C., League Minutes, p. 58. This interpretation directly contradicts Comrade Pozadovsky's categorical statement at the Congress about a serious difference of opinion and disagreement on a fundamental question. On this fundamental question, all the Iskroists at the Congress opposed the spokesman of the anti-Iskra right, Goldblatt, and of the Congress Center, Igorov. This is a fact, and one may safely assert that if the Center, I hope this word will shock the official supporters of madness less than any other, had had occasion to speak without restraint, through the mouth of Comrade Igorov or Makehoff, on this or on analogous questions, the serious difference of opinion would have been revealed at once. It was revealed even more distinctly over the matter of equality of languages, Minutes, p. 171 et seq. On this point it was not so much the debate that was so eloquent, but the voting. Counting up the times a vote was taken, we get the incredible number of 16. Over what? Over whether it was enough to stipulate in the program the equality of all citizens irrespective of sex, etc., and language, or whether it was necessary to stipulate freedom of language, or equality of languages. Comrade Martov characterized this episode fairly accurately at the League Congress when he said that a trifling dispute over the formulation of one point of the program became a matter of principle because half the Congress was prepared to overthrow the program committee. Precisely. 2. Martov added, on this occasion much harm was done by Plekhanov's witticism about asses. When the question of freedom of language was being discussed, a Bundist, I think it was, mentioned stud farms among other institutions, whereupon Plekhanov said in a loud undertone, horses don't talk, but asses sometimes do. I cannot, of course, see anything particularly mild, accommodating, tactful or flexible about this witticism. But I find it strange that Martov, who admitted that the dispute became a matter of principle, made absolutely no attempt to analyze what this principle was and what shades of opinion found expression here, but confined himself to talking about the harmfulness of witticisms. This is indeed a bureaucratic and formalistic attitude. It is true that much harm was done at the Congress by cutting witticisms, leveled not only at the Bundists, but also at those whom the Bundists sometimes supported and even saved from defeat. However, once you admit that the incident involved principles, you cannot confine yourself to phrases about the impermissibility, League Minutes, p. 58, of certain witticisms. Lenin. The immediate cause of the conflict was indeed trifling, yet it did become a matter of principle and consequently assumed terribly bitter forms, even to the point of attempts to overthrow the program committee, of suspecting people of a desire to mislead the Congress, as Igorov suspected Martov, and of personal remarks of the most abusive kind, p. 178. Even Comrade Popov expressed regret that mere trifles had given rise to such an atmosphere, my italics, p. 182, as prevailed during the course of 3 sittings, the 16th, 17th and 18th. All these expressions very definitely and categorically point to the extremely important fact that the atmosphere of suspicion and of the most bitter forms of conflict, overthrowing for which later, at the League Congress, the Iskra-ist majority were held responsible! Actually arose long before we split into a majority and minority. I repeat, this is a fact of enormous importance, a fundamental fact, and failure to understand it leads a great many people to very thoughtless conclusions about the majority at the end of the Congress having been artificial. From the present point of view of Comrade Martov, who asserts that 9/10 of the Congress delegates were Iskroists, the fact that mere trifles, a trivial cause, could give rise to a conflict which became a matter of principle and nearly led to the overthrow of a Congress commission is absolutely inexplicable and absurd. It would be ridiculous to evade this fact with lamentations and regrets about harmful witticisms. No cutting witticisms could have made the conflict a matter of principle. It could become that only because of the character of the political groupings at the Congress. It was not cutting remarks and witticisms that gave rise to the conflict. They were only a symptom of the fact that the Congress political grouping itself harbored a contradiction, that it harbored all the makings of a conflict, that it harbored an internal heterogeneity which burst forth with imminent force at the least cause, even the most trifling. On the other hand, from the point of view from which I regard the Congress, and which I deem it my duty to uphold as a definite political interpretation of the events, even though this interpretation may seem offensive to some, From this point of view, the desperately acute conflict of principle that arose from a trifling cause is quite explicable and inevitable, since a struggle between the Escroists and the anti-Escroists went on all the time at our Congress, since between them stood unstable elements, and since the latter, together with the anti-Escroists, controlled 1/3 of the votes. 8 plus 10 equals 18, out of 51, according to my calculation, an approximate one. Of course, it is perfectly clear and natural that any falling away from the Escroists of even a small minority created the possibility of a victory for the anti-Escro trend and therefore evoked a frenzied struggle. This was not the result of improper cutting remarks and attacks, but of the political combination. It was not cutting remarks that gave rise to the political conflict. It was the existence of a political conflict in the very grouping at the Congress that gave rise to cutting remarks and attacks. This contrast expresses the cardinal disagreement in principle between Martov and myself in appraising the political significance of the Congress and its results. In all, there were during the Congress 3 major cases of a small number of Escroists falling away from the majority, over the equality of languages question, over paragraph 1 of the rules, and over the elections, and in all 3 cases a fierce struggle ensued, finally leading to the severe crisis we have in the party today. For a political understanding of this crisis and this struggle, we must not confine ourselves to phrases about the impermissibility of witticisms, but must examine the political grouping of the shades that clashed at the Congress. The equality of languages incident is therefore doubly interesting as far as ascertaining the causes of the divergence is concerned, for here Martov was, still was, an Escroist and fought the anti-Escroists and the centre harder perhaps than anybody else. The war opened with an argument between Comrade Martov and Comrade Lieber, the leader of the Bundists, pages 171 to 72. Martov argued that the demand for equality of citizens was enough. Freedom of language was rejected, but equality of languages was forthwith proposed, and Comrade Egorov joined Lieber in the fray. Martov declared that it was fetishism when speakers insist that nationalities are equal and transfer inequality to the sphere of language, whereas the question should be examined from just the opposite angle. Inequality of nationalities exists, and one of its expressions is that people belonging to certain nations are deprived of the right to use their mother tongue, p. 172. The Martov was absolutely right. The totally baseless attempt of Lieber and Egorov to insist on the correctness of their formulation and make out that we were unwilling or unable to uphold the principle of equality of nationalities was indeed a sort of fetishism. Actually, they were, like fetish worshippers, defending the word and not the principle, acting not from fear of committing an error of principle, but from fear of what people might say. This shaky mentality, what if others blame us for this, which we already noted in connection with the organizing committee incident, was quite clearly displayed here by our entire center. Another of its spokesmen, the mining area delegate Lvov, who stood close to Yuzhny Rabochi, declared that the question of the suppression of languages which has been raised by the border districts is a very serious one. It is important to include a point on language in our program and thus obviate any possibility of the Social Democrats being suspected of Russifying tendencies. A remarkable explanation of the seriousness of the question. It is very serious because possible suspicions on the part of the border districts must be obviated. The speaker says absolutely nothing on the substance of the question. He does not rebut the charge of fetishism but entirely confirms it, for he shows a complete lack of arguments of his own and merely talks about what the border districts may say. Everything they may say will be untrue is told. But instead of examining whether it is true or not, he replies, they may suspect. Such a presentation of the question, coupled with the claim that it is serious and important, does indeed raise an issue of principle, but by no means the one the Liebers, Egorovs, and Lvovs would discern in it. The principle involved is, should we leave it to the organizations and members of the party to apply the general and fundamental theses of the program to their specific conditions, and to develop them for the purpose of such application, or are we, merely out of fear of suspicion, to fill the program with petty details, minutiae, repetitions, and casuistry? The principle involved is, how can Social Democrats discern, suspect, in the fight against casuistry and attempt to restrict elementary democratic rights and liberties? When are we going to wean ourselves at last from this fetishist worship of casuistry? That was the thought that occurred to us when watching this struggle over languages. The grouping of the delegates in this struggle is made particularly clear by the abundant roll call votes. There were as many as 3. All the time the Iskra Corps was solidly opposed by the anti-Iskroists, 8 votes, and, with very slight fluctuations, by the whole center, Makhov, Lvov, Igorov, Popov, Medvedev, Ivanov, Zuryev, and Belov. Only the last 2 vacillated at first, now abstaining, now voting with us, and it was only during the 3rd vote that their position became fully defined. Of the Iskroists, several fell away, chiefly the Caucasians, 3 with 6 votes, and thanks to this the fetishist trend ultimately gained the upper hand. During the 3rd vote, when the followers of both trends had clarified their position most fully, the 3 Caucasians, with 6 votes, broke away from the majority Iskroists and went over to the other side. 2 delegates, Pozadovsky and Kostich, with 2 votes, fell away from the minority Iskroists. During the first 2 votes, the following had gone over to the other side or abstained: Lenski, Stepanov, and Gorsky of the Iskra-IST majority, and Deutsch of the minority. The falling away of 8 Iskra-IST votes, out of a total of 33, gave the superiority to the coalition of the anti-Iskroists and the unstable elements. It was just this fundamental fact of the Congress grouping that was repeated, only with other Iskroists falling away, during the vote on paragraph 1 of the rules and during the elections. It is not surprising that those who were defeated in the elections now carefully close their eyes to the political reasons for the defeat, to the starting points of that conflict of shades which progressively revealed the unstable and politically spineless elements and exposed them ever more relentlessly in the eyes of the party. The equality of languages incident shows us this conflict all the more clearly because at that time Comrade Martov had not yet earned the praises and approval of Akhimov and Makhov.